Hello and welcome to the Remaining Sane Finding Peace in Our Chaos podcast, a podcast about both theology and police work. I'm your host, Will, and in today's episode, I interview a current priest in Anglican Church of North America, Phil Hanner. Hey Phil, how are you?
Doing well, thank you. How are you?
Good. Before we get started, would you mind giving us a background as to who you are, any experience with law enforcement, just 5-10 minutes about Phil Hanner?
Sure, happy to. I grew up in a kind of military home. My dad worked for the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, which I know is now a popular TV show. My dad likes to remind me that it's nothing like his work. But my family grew up with just a wonderful family. My father and mother stayed together, which is a real gift. And I was born in Spain. My dad was working at a Navy base over there. And we moved around a lot. I'd say every 2 to 3 years as a family. Frankly, I really enjoyed it. My parents were very open to culture and introducing us to new experiences. And it was a wonderful home to grow up in. But my father was I never really knew all that he did, except that a lot of it had to do with counterterrorism. And that's something I probably didn't even fully understand or appreciate as a kid. But he did a really good job at his job. And it was kind of neat sometimes to hear stories later on about maybe cases that he solved or, things once things were no longer secret or whatever, you were able to share them. It was neat. My father, one thing that I think he did a really good job at was not bringing his work home with him. And I know that's really hard for most people, myself included as a priest. But he did a really good job at sort of leaving his work at the door and then coming in and then just engaging. I think being present. And most of us know when we're talking to someone. Even now, I think this particular context is unique because in being recorded and intentionally talking maybe softer and slower, we're both listening and engaging in a way that frankly, we don't get to do much, maybe with the exception of over coffee or and something like that. It's just a unique context. But
so I want to touch on that. You said
sure.
Your dad did a good job of, not taking his work home,
mm-hmm.
right? And that's something we've talked about before, like having to cleanse yourself essentially
mm-hmm,
of
mm-hmm.
the things that are around you, right? And I know that there's parallels there, being a priest, being clergy,
sure.
that you get exposed to all kinds of the bad stuff going on, right?
Yeah.
And I think that especially a local police officer has a special parallel to a local, just a not a bishop or not a any kind of archbishop, but a
local priest,
a local priest, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or a local pastor,
local
right?
pastor,
Whatever
sure.
tradition you're from,
mm-hmm.
because the sin that you may see is you're I don't want to say you're living in it, but you're living around it, right? Like you see this person, like people may bring stuff to you, and then you see these people, and that all this stuff's going on, and it's hard to not just internalize it, right?
Sure.
And not to feel like you're almost becoming part of it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I think, when Jesus said, be in the world, but not of it, that's kind of a challenging notion for a police officer or a pastor, because, for me, someone who comes in and confesses sin, I might see at Trader Joe's. And for you probably have the same thing where you might have arrested a guy and then a week or two later with your family getting ice cream, see them out. It's a challenge for sure.
Or he moves in 2 houses down from you. Yeah,
I can only imagine.
Yeah, true story. Not the first, but I think the second arrest that I ever found out the dude was my neighbor.
Oh wow!
So
wow.
Yeah, and it was a pretty bad one too. So
yeah.
But anyways, so you grew up moving around.
Mm-hmm.
How did you end up becoming a priest?
Eventually, during college. So during college, my parents and I had just some difficulty. Some of it was sin. Some of it was just communication. Some of it was foolishness and perhaps just needing some guidance. But we were able to reconcile through some of our struggles. We actually met with the local pastor of our church and were able to confess some sin and also maybe invite an outside party to kind of weigh into some of our struggles. And we had all had some difficulties and frustrations and even just some anger in the way we dealt with one another. And it was in being confronted by some of the patterns of our relationship, by a pastor that really freed us up to maybe seek repentance and reconciliation for the first time in a very meaningful way. And it was through that I really began to love God and the grace and the mercy that he affords us. But not only that, but the wisdom that he wants to offer us to grow so that we're no longer enslaved by those former patterns. And so, the human condition is one of, we're sinful, we're weak, sometimes we're insecure and we're victims and we victimize other people. We do all those things. And so we need both healing and forgiveness. And Jesus alone, I think, affords that in a way that's meaningful.
That's something I want to touch on, is the fact that licentiousness is not freedom. And I think especially, this is a unique American problem, in so much as in this country, we have a tradition of freedom, right? Quote unquote freedom, having personal liberty, right? One of the big reasons why the first people that came to this continent was to escape religious persecution, right? And so, but one of the things that I think that, a lot of people don't understand today is that sin enslaves you, and you being quote unquote free to sin, all it is you diving farther and farther into slavery. And so in today's culture, we may even celebrate sin. And the fact of the matter is, all celebrating sin does is enslave you further, because sin is this, the way that I like to almost see it is like it's this weight, or it's like this anchor that just continues to get heavier and heavier, and you're just struggling, and then eventually it pulls you under and you can't get away from it unless you have some kind of drastic unless you have some kind of change of the patterns in which you're living your life, right? A classic example of this would be, I think for men, a huge issue is pornography, or and I think someone that maybe doesn't have an understanding of why pornography is wrong would just say, I watch pornography, or I cheat on my wife, or this, that, and the other, and why is it wrong? And well, the fact of the matter is, not only does that have physical ramifications, won't get farther into those, but it does condition your mind to look at women in, let me rephrase that. It conditions your mind to look at women not as people, but as objects. I think that's part of it. And then part of it is it just creates, I think that there's been some recent research that has showed that if someone consistently watches pornography from a young age, they have a hard time controlling their impulses, or having a bad decision-making faculties, or they're not fully developed. And so that enslaves you, because you're stuck in the cycle where you can't make, or where you just want to go willy-nilly towards a bunch of different things, and you can't really make a decision or decide, or the decisions you make you're not too sure of, and it just kind of leaves you just continuing to fall further down into this pit of sin, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so one of the things that I want to get to is, in our church tradition,
yeah,
the way in which that we start moving away from that, moving away from licentiousness is, first of all, addressing it, right? We can actually confess, right?
Calling it what it is.
Yeah. And then asking for forgiveness for it, right?
Correct.
But then, making some kind of substantial change, not only in our heads, but in our bodies that, would promote a long-term change against the sin. And once again, I looked for, when I think about, problems with pornography, a common cure for that for men is fasting. Because the one thing that's going to override your sex drive is your hunger.
Correct.
And so, that's been a common cure ever since, the days of the apostles. All the way back to, Augustine talked about it a bunch, right?
Right.
You have any thoughts?
I do. I think what you're saying is so true, particularly, starting with freedom. If you want to start with freedom, I think traditionally in Greek and Roman and Judeo-Christian worldview, freedom was your capacity to do what is right and virtuous before God. Now, I think that freedom has been reassigned into this sort of liberty to do whatever you damn well please. And that is not freedom. That, as you pointed out, is enslavement and, in fact, the road to damnation. And so when we talk about freedom, when we talk about a bird, for example, the greatest expression of freedom in a bird is flying. And so if you see a bird awkwardly walking on the ground like a peregrine falcon or some awesome bird of prey, it's actually grievous. And you realize you're not living into your potential freedom. And I think the same is true for us as people. If we're created in God's image and God has a design for us, then our greatest expression of freedom is denying those things which are harmful and living into our capacity as image bearers of God to do what is right and noble and good. And so I think you're absolutely right there. And so sin struggles and weakness struggles, and specifically pornography, as you pointed out, is such a tragic snare that constantly holds you back. And that, I think, is the way traditionally we've seen, sin as both an offense against God, an ensnarement in your life that prevents you from exercising your true freedom. But you're right. Part of the way in which we exercise that self-control is by maybe starting with self-control somewhere else so that we can begin to show self-control in the area of internet pornography especially. And so when we do fast, we're reminded that we can deny ourselves and still survive. And I think the same is true with pornography, or, for example, maybe getting rid of your cell phone. Sometimes you have to take extreme measures in order to release something that's holding you hostage. And so for some people, I know a lot of young men now that have flip phones, and it's really hard to look at pornography on a flip phone, by the grace of God, right? So, so I think a willingness sometimes to sacrifice will actually strengthen you to sacrifice in other areas. I think of like your interest in physical fitness, and a lot of police officers are very physically fit, but sometimes and I wish it translated more, but my hope is that sort of physical discipline would translate into discipline in other areas.
Yes. This is 100%. We got into the last episode, that what started my conversion from, I don't want to say I was ever a nihilist, but I was like a nun, right? The NONE, right?
Oh, sure.
I was just kind of was very ambivalent about God. Maybe I went to church, but didn't really care. But what got me to realize that God exists is that realizing that I'm, we're embodied.
Right.
And it was through physical fitness that I understood the concept of self-discipline, and then beyond that started understanding some of these Christian virtues. And then from there, I've since become, that has led me not only to a more liturgical, sacramental lifestyle,
right,
but it has also led me towards the profession that I have, towards the vocation that I have, which is, being a law enforcement officer, because it involves not only working with my mind, but it also involves working with my body, and I think that that's important.
I agree,
because if we're stuck one way or the other, then we can really neglect the however you want to break up the human body, whether it be body mind and soul, or
Right.
C.S. Lewis says the head, the heart, and the gut. However you want to break it up, if we don't work on one, then we neglect the others.
No, I agree, and I think the what you're pointing out is a type of freedom. I think of your strength training actually equips you to do things like maybe lift your child with greater ease or something like that. And the reality is, I think sometimes there is a sort of invisible line within most disciplines where the more disciplined we are, actually the more freedom we have to do certain things.
Yes.
So the more you exercise, the more freedom you have to, say, hike mountains. Or in your case, again, if you study, grammar and word memorization and that sort of thing, eventually you can learn another language. And so freedom for someone who has put in the work of a language looks like being able to switch from English to Spanish rather quickly in talking to two different people at a party. Right? But that is freedom. Freedom is actually your capacity to do something that's truly good, a la speaking a different language with someone else and appreciating them wherever they're from. But it only comes through discipline. And so whether it's physical fitness or language or even maybe fighting sin, the freedom that we're hoping for is no longer being enslaved to something that was ruining us. And so I think of, like, for example, with internet pornography, one thing that's always like really encouraging, when I meet with young men who are struggling with this, is that moment when something pops up on the internet and you hit the X button, where you had the temptation to click on something, but you hit X instead, because you then had the freedom to say no to something that would have been very easy and no one would have even caught you. Yeah. How empowering is that for someone to say, I could have done something that would have led me down a path to destruction, but instead I very quickly said no, and I took a different route. And that's it. There's actually a joy to it. And I love walking with young men, especially, and there's all kinds of people struggle with it. Please, and so there's no sin which most people don't struggle with.
No, if there is a man that says that he's never struggled with pornography, then he is a liar. Not only does he struggle with pornography, then he also struggles with lying.
Sure.
Yeah.
No. Yeah. Or he's Amish and just never had access to the internet. I don't know. I mean, there's. Yeah. I totally agree.
Yeah. So transitioning just a bit. One of the problems that we have is that we, even with whether it be alcohol or whether it be pornography like we talked about, or whether it be gossip, lying, just whatever sin. Mm-hmm. Being a police officer, you are going to get exposed to sin. It happens all the time.
Sure.
Almost all law breaking also involves a sinful element. Getting beyond,
yeah, for sure.
And I get it, like the petty stuff, like driving without a seatbelt, or
jaywalking,
driving without a license, jaywalking, whatever. Okay, that's not really.
Yeah.
But once you start getting into like domestic violence, or heck, DUI, or and once again aggravated assault, murder, rape,
sure.
whatever, you get exposed to a lot of these bad things.
Absolutely.
Right? And something else we talked about, not only do we see them, we touch them, we smell them, we unfortunately sometimes we taste them, like
right.
That's disgusting, but sometimes it just happens, so how do we cleanse that before we go back into our house? Right.
No, that's $1 million question. Absolutely. I think, when I think about Jesus, one of the unique things about him was that when he touched unclean people, he made them clean. I don't have that same power. And so, as you pointed out, I will often experience great evil, adultery. I don't know if I'm tempted to sin in all the ways in which people, come to me, but there's some that I most assuredly am. And anger. I may not have murdered someone, but I certainly struggle with anger, lust, envying what other people have. And there's all kinds of ways in which I can struggle, and anyone, one of us can struggle. But I think you're right. Experiencing the hardship and difficulty and sin that other people are going through, and not taking it on or allowing one of the thoughts that maybe someone even had or mentioned or something like that, and allowing that to sort of cogitate in your mind is a challenge. So sometimes when someone confesses, oh, I was struggling with pornography, or I wanted to commit adultery or something like that, a seed can be sown in my own mind that I can't water. And I think one of the difficult things that I've always struggled with is saying, like, well, how do I not bring the worries and anxieties of work back into my home? And that has always been a challenge. I remember I used to be a social worker, and when this concept was first sort of thrust into my face, I was probably 23, 24 years old, and I was standing outside of a school where I was a behavioral specialist with, the troublesome kids, whatever, however you want to say it. And I said good morning to a student, and he tried to punch me in the face. And thankfully he missed. I was a bit quicker when I was younger, I suppose. I don't know. But he was a good kid overall. And I said, why did you punch me? I had to discipline him, of course. So I took him into the office. I said, why did you just try to punch me? And he goes, my dad got angry with me this morning, and so you were an adult, and I got angry at you. And it just really made the connection there. He brought it to school. And I can do that in a very similar way if I go home with whatever stuff I'm dealing with. Yeah. And so I want to be careful. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. No, if you talk to any police officer who's, mom or dad, I don't know any cop that doesn't, delve into that cop talking mentality, or that cop talk, right, with their kids, because there are parallels to it, right?
Oh, for sure.
I joke that all I do is deal with adult children all day, but unfortunately that's kind of true, but I can't treat my kid like I treat somebody on the street.
Right, for sure.
And because there are ontological differences between the people that I deal with and my kid, especially how I'm related to those people.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely.
And so, side note, reminder, so ontology or ontological basically means the way in which something is. So my relationship with my kid is a different relationship than the relationship I have with someone that I meet on the street. So, and I assume that the same stuff happens, being a priest, right?
Absolutely.
Like you want to kind of deal with your kids, or maybe sometimes, unfortunately, maybe your wife or other family members as you would when you're parishioners, but they're different. And so it's kind of strange, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a degree to it. You want to almost switch gears a little bit when you come home, knowing that, home, while you might have some chaos, is more of a safe place where the way you engage is different. The types of dynamics that you experience are going to be a bit different. And also you don't want to take whatever emotional energy or spiritual energy, or what do you want to say, that you're bringing back from work, and then sort of treat your kids differently, or treat your wife differently, or your husband differently as a result of that. Yeah. I think that's one thing that's really difficult is finding a place to sort of say, I'm going to take off whatever's polluted you. Like if you've dealt with, if you got blood on you, you'd probably want to take a shower, right? Like if you got some kind of gross thing on you, you need to wash yourself. And there's a degree to which we kind of need to do the same thing with our hearts and minds, right? We want to come home and have, we're not trying to add to the drama of the home. When I go home, my wife has already been, probably dealing with some knockout dragouts with 3 boys. And so I want to make sure that I'm participating towards the peace of the house and to bless my wife, rather than bringing all of my struggles in and then just adding to the pile. Yeah. And I think that's really difficult for most of us. Yeah. So that's a huge struggle.
Especially after a long shift, right? Because once again, another thing that cops are infamous for doing is working long hours. And then I would dare to say that working a shift as a police officer, kind of like working a shift for like at a some kind of like hardcore or hard labor plant, or not something where you go into an office, but you're actually out there physically doing something. It's a little bit harder to come home and not bring more stress, because you've been dealing with stress and people and all these bad things all day, right?
Yeah, not to mention maybe even some of your coworkers who are dealing with their own stuff as well.
And so this is why I think it's important I don't know if other people do this as well, but I think it's very important that when I get home, that my clothes, my vestments of being a police officer come off, because I'm not a cop when I'm at the house.
Right.
And that I take that stuff and move it away, and I don't look at it.
Right.
Because it's not who I am at the house. I'm at the house, I'm a dad, I'm a husband.
Sure.
Right. So Phil, kind of along these lines, I know that another thing that we've talked about with vocations is that they're callings. They're not
right.
Vocations are work,
sure,
but they're also a calling to a certain kind of work.
Right.
And one of the differences between a vocation and just an occupation is that most anyone's skill set can fulfill a certain vocation, but a certain occupation requires a certain skill set. So what I'm saying is all kinds of different people, like everyone from a philosopher to a farmhand, has certain skills that can contribute to the calling, to the vocation of being a cop or clergy or firefighter, something like that, right?
Yep.
But some of those, having a farmhand be an accountant is going to be, there may be a couple of things that overlap, but it may be a little bit more difficult to make that transition. But one of the things about vocations is I think that almost universally they become, they bear on you over time. And a lot of times, especially in positions of, clergy, police officer, I put nurse up here. It really wears on you. And so would you mind, talking about how to deal with, burnout?
Sure. Well, I think what's interesting is as you say that, I used to be a therapist before I was a priest, and I have often met with people and just listened, for the most part. And as you say that, you're absolutely right. Nurses, police officers, sometimes, believe it or not, pastors too. The average lifespan of a pastor is 5 years. Did you know that?
I did not.
Yeah. So a lot of people get emotionally wrought, fraught with struggle, or things don't work out the way they want. And so they burn out. I know with police officers, there's a lot of burnout, nurses, but also I think there's just a lot of coping mechanisms that people use. Sometimes it's alcohol. Sometimes it's just maybe not pornography, but just like drowning yourself in TV. Sometimes it's eating. There's lots of ways in which we can allow ourselves to indulge as a form of escape. But I think it was, in the Psalms, there's this wonderful example that kind of rings through the Psalm, and that's just asking the Lord for help. And that's a theme, probably one of the most important themes in the Psalms. And I remember in seminary, I had a professor that said this. It said, when you're struggling, you will either call out to God, or you'll call out to an alcohol bottle, or you'll call out to porn, or you'll call out to something else. And I think he's right. We have to do something with the anxieties and the struggles and the overwhelming sensation that we're alone in the world, or that no one understands our struggles like we do, or all the sort of temptations I think that all of us have. And if we don't have places where we can sort of take our burdens and lay them down, whether that's with someone else like a friend or with God, it would be obviously, I'm biased here, but as a pastor, then we will turn to something else for hope and help in our time of need. Right? That's very biblical language. We're looking for hope and help in our time of need. And I think burnout can often happen if we don't have some preparation, some plan to say, when I'm going to struggle, I know where I'm going to turn. Or I know these are some ways in which I can find rest. So I think, when you have long shifts like you're talking about, sometimes 12, 15, 16-hour shifts, it's hard for me to watch, because I know that those people are struggling to serve our community and essentially laying down their lives for the community. And then when they come home, if they don't have tools to say, what are you going to do with the transitions? I think the transitions are hard, right? To come home and, like you were pointing out, say, I'm taking this vestment or this sign of that identity off and embracing my God-given identity as a father or a husband or what have you. if we don't have a plan for that, I think we'll kind of slip into whatever's easy. And for a lot of people, it's just maybe an extra glass of wine, then two, then we find out that we're drinking whole bottles. You know what I mean? Like, and I'm not even judging. I think the same happens with pills. So many people will get into a car accident and your neck hurts for a little while, and then the pills feel good. And then next thing you know, you're refilling them. You don't really need them. You know what I mean? And so there's a sense in which we can kind of slide into whatever feels good and is easy, And so I think we need to, like you said earlier, we just need to call things what they are, and address. My temptation tonight is to forget about work by doing this thing. Yeah. And if we don't have, I'd say positive can be sort of maybe therapeutic, but if we don't have good ways in which we can deal with our stressors, deal with our problems, people who can help bear those burdens with us, then I think invariably we will turn to something that will be our own destruction.
Yeah, there's a officer that works at our department that he will only pick up his phone for other police officers during the 40 hours that week he's working. He will not answer texts. He will not answer emails. He won't do anything else. Only when he's working is when he'll have any engagement with being a police officer.
Sure.
And he's better for it. I think that is a really good practice because he's not thinking about being a cop. He lives his life. He goes to work, and he doesn't internalize any of the stuff that's going on. Right.
Absolutely.
He's not just carrying that around with him all the time.
Sure.
I think with that, we're going to take a quick break. Alrighty, and we're back. So Phil, one of the things that you mentioned before the break is that in order for us to combat some of these sinful behaviors that can take hold of us, is that we need to have good practices for when we make the transition back to our home life. Would you mind talking a little bit about what are some of those practices that we can take? An actual example. Maybe it's not going to apply to everybody, but what's a good example of something that someone can do who is maybe struggling with this?
Sure. I think when we're recognizing that we're having difficulty, and maybe that's perhaps one of the hardest things, like what's the canary in the coal mine, right? Maybe it's yelling at your kid when you're like, why did I even yell at my kid or something like that, or realizing that like watching your Netflix account, I spent 3 hours watching shows tonight. Why did I do that? Or whatever. Once you maybe realize that, I think starting to acknowledge, man, I might want to turn a corner and start to fill my time with something else. I think you're healthier than I am, but one thing I like to do is I don't want to eat my vegetables. Like in general, I would say like that's not something I want to do. So
I don't either. You're feeling better.
Fair enough.
I hate eating vegetables.
Okay, good. Well, see, but at the same point, I think that your body will feel better if you do eat them, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Right. And so for me, the sort of the same principle can apply. I joke sometimes. My primary job as a pastor is to sort of say, eat your spiritual vegetables, to make practices and habits that inform the way you live and think and feel. Because, sometimes I don't feel like eating vegetables, but I do it because I know that it will affect my day, even though I may not realize it in the moment because my feelings are betraying the truth. Right? And I think for a lot of us, our feelings can betray the truth. And when we come back or when we're thinking about job, when we're working or when we're coming home from work, we may have already resigned ourselves in our minds to say, man, I don't even know what I'm going to do. I think a lot of times evil can take place in the context of someone who is bored and is maybe uncreative. I think of my own kids. If my kids aren't doing something, they're going to gravitate towards wrestling or hitting each other in the face. And I think as adults, we do that in maybe different ways.
Boredom is the workshop of the devil, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, one of the things that you actually mentioned on a different podcast is that one of the things that you implore families that are at your parish to do is to pray as a family.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And, sometimes you don't feel like doing it.
Yeah, right.
But it's still a good thing to do it. Right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Like one of the things that, our family does is, I've tried to do with the days that I'm off and actually see them, is do the evening, like the 5-10 minute daily Anglican prayer.
Yeah.
Right. The evening prayers, because we're all together. We all sit together. We all say the same thing. My kid may be, screaming, crying, jumping up and down, whatever. But it's still a good thing to physically actually do this thing, even if we're not quote unquote feeling it, even
Right.
if it's not
Right.
just like some extemporaneous wanting to do this, it's still a good thing to do it.
Absolutely.
Right.
And your kid might not remember the words, 5 years from now, but what they will remember is that mom and dad valued this. Mom and dad valued being thankful to God and being humble and acknowledging that there's a God who cares for them together for an intentional time every night.
Because we know this. It's one thing to say that these things are important to you, and it's another thing to stand up and do these things. Right? Like everyone can talk about how good it is to be physically fit.
Sure.
But it takes someone actually doing it to turn around and actually mean something to them.
Right. Well, I think what's interesting, that just a point that I think you're making, is when you do exercise or when you engage in a discipline, the action itself, exercise, is good and beneficial, but also the product is good and beneficial. Strength, heart health, cardiovascular improvement, that sort of thing. And I think the same is true when you're thinking about avoiding burnout, is how do I make plans and preparations that will be good for me in a long-term sense, even though I might not see the initial gain within, say, a day or 2 days or 3 days. And I think embracing old patterns, like well-worn paths, can actually be enormously helpful. You just mentioned in embracing a prayer life, and the ritual of a daily prayer is thousands of years old. So you're participating in a long history of saints who have gone before you, who have prayed the same prayers for maybe 2,000 years.
Yeah, that's something that Dr. Barnard talked about, previous guest, is that the Christian stories, the stories in the Bible, become our stories, and then our stories join with the Christian body, right? Like, my very tiny, minuscule story does become part of the grand story of Christ.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
And I think it's important for us to realize this. We're not the center of the universe. We're not. But we only see the universe through our eyes. Like we only interact with the universe through our five senses.
Right.
But we're not the center of it, but we can fall very easily into the, pride is the root of all sin, right?
Sure.
It's believing that we are the ones that matter the most above others.
Right.
Right. And so because, it's a universal human failure that we continue to see the world as revolving around us as opposed to other people, that negates that doing that, seeing the world through just your own eyes and not realizing that other people matter, right?
Mm-hmm.
Believing yourself to be better than other people makes it so that your story can't be added to the greater story because you value yourself more than you value Christ.
Yeah,
Right.
right.
And Christ and the saints and just other people around you. Right.
That's right.
And so I think it's very important for us to become humble and realize that, I've got a very small, minute story here.
Mm-hmm.
And if this podcast or whatever I do does anything to help someone else come to Christ, that's what I want the most. What I want is people to be involved in the body of Christ and for their
Right.
story to be joined with Christ.
Absolutely.
Not with my story, who cares about Will's story, right?
That's right.
It's I've got a whole lot of really crazy, really weird police stories that I can get into.
Well,
but it's not.
I think what's interesting, by the way, is what you're pointing out. Your story does matter to the body. In other words, like in submitting yourself to a body, your stories actually matter more. When you make yourself less, what you provide is the opportunity for people to engage with you, such that your stories actually become more important because they're a part of a family. And I think that's like so often we're trying to celebrate ourselves such that we miss the joy of struggling alongside of other people. I think if you remember, there was a band called Pink Floyd, and prophets, absolute prophets. But they said in this song called "Wish You Were Here," they actually say, "You traded a walk-on part in the war for a lead role in a cage." I think that's really how much of our thinking sort of can ruin us, is to think of ourselves, I'd rather be important, in a corner than participating in the bigger story. In a war, World War II especially, there's a noble end. And it's dangerous, and it's not about you, and all you've got is your family that you're with, essentially attempting to achieve a bigger cause. Now, I'm not trying to glamorize war, please understand, but what I am saying is if you don't make life all about you, you actually find that you're more important because you're integral to the people around you.
Yeah, you become part of this great. I don't want to be heretical here, but this great perfect story, right?
Sure.
You become.
Oh yeah, God's story is perfect for sure. Yeah.
That your story contributes to this greater, to eventually his coming back, right? That's where it's going to end.
Yeah, right.
In that this meantime, this waiting time, the seventh day that we're in right now is the build up for that.
Yeah.
And we don't know if it's going to be tomorrow, and we don't know if it's going to be in a million years. But it's we have to have faith, hope, and trust that God is going to come back.
Absolutely.
Right.
And in the meantime, God's given us tools to grow until then.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of what I like to think about with people, especially as they're struggling with, dealing with real problems. I mean, the thing is, like, we don't belittle or make less the issues that people are experiencing. Police officers, nurses, anyone dealing with people and pain and sorrow are going to bring that home with them, and we don't have to pretend like it doesn't exist. We're not ostriches, with their head in the sand. We embrace the reality that life is hard. In Job, we read, "Man is born into struggle. Surely as the sparks fly upward." Yeah. And it's okay. It's okay to struggle. But what we do with that struggle is so important. And I think that's why it's so helpful to have a plan, to think about yourself and your situation, to think about your family, to think about those around you. And then also maybe even to find other activities in your life that you can learn to enjoy. What I have found that for a lot of people who struggle with addictions, whether that's alcohol or pornography or whatever, getting a hobby can be very helpful. I knew someone one time that was very addicted to pornography, and he actually got into model trains, and he would build trains, and other people would see them, and he'd keep them up, and like for Christmas and stuff like that. And what was interesting is model trains perhaps isn't like a super trendy thing, right?
Not very ubiquitous.
No. But at least he found something that he was interested in that turned out to be an opportunity to invite other people into something he did. And I would say I would much rather choose someone getting really into model trains than, say, heroin. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or something like that. Yeah. But we all need places to output or input our desires, our energies, our hopes. And not that you can place your hope in a train set, but we need to have ways in which we can express ourselves and participate in hobbies that can be good. And that might be learning a musical instrument or learning how to paint.
My brother does math.
Really?
Yeah.
No way.
Sit there and do calculus just to keep his mind occupied with
That's
something else.
great.
Yeah.
No, my kids are in classical school, and so sometimes I'm trying to. I used to have to memorize Latin. I have a wildlife biology undergrad, and so I used to have to memorize lots of Latin. And so it's fun now sometimes to get back into Latin, and it's nerdy. It's absolutely nerdy. I'm very aware, but it's better than a lot of other thinking.
Yeah.
You know.
Oh yeah. It's a whole lot more edifying than
Absolutely.
than, doing nothing, right? Well, Phil, I before we get done, I was wondering, do you have any parting words, any advice, anything you want to say to the audience?
No, I think it would be a shame if people who are giving themselves for the sake of their fellow brothers and sisters would fall into despair and turn to things that would hurt them. And I think my hope and prayer would be that those who are truly doing good things would also experience the good fruit of their endeavor and not maybe fall into some kind of sin or struggle that would somehow nullify or corrupt it or destroy the other things in their life that are sacred. I think that happens so often is we end up giving ourselves for one thing only to find that if we don't take care of the other areas of our life, they can be destroyed. And I think that's what happens so often for people very well-meaning people who are trying to do good things for their fellow brothers and sisters in the world. And so I think learning a little bit of wisdom, and my hope and prayer is just people would pursue wisdom because there's great blessing in that, to understand and appreciate that God's good design is far better than they could even imagine.
Thank you for those words, Phil. So we've talked about a little bit cleansing ourselves of this sin, and both you and I are Anglicans. I have mentioned this over and over that I really think that a liturgical sacramental lifestyle is essential for police officers. Not going to say that you can't be a successful cop and do this X, Y, and Z and not have a quote unquote liturgical lifestyle, but I think it's very important. And so instead of giving my normal spiel, what we're going to do for our ending is we're going to say the general Anglican Thanksgiving. So Phil, would you mind starting us off?
Yes, sir. Almighty God, Father of all mercies, we, your unworthy servants, give you humble thanks for all your goodness and loving kindness to us and to all whom you have made. We bless you for our creation, preservation, and all the blessings of this life, but above all for your immeasurable love in the redemption of the world by our Lord Jesus Christ, for the means of grace and for the hope of glory. And we pray, give us such an awareness of your mercies, that with truly thankful hearts we may show forth your praise, not only with our lips, but in our lives, by giving up ourselves to your service, and by walking before you in holiness and righteousness all our days. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, to whom with you and the Holy Spirit be honor and glory throughout all ages. Amen.